collecting, classifying, and organizing data using tables, charts, and graphs. And the key concepts for that are explaining relationships, describing examples, and select procedures. DOK 3, when we're talking about science, has to do with strategic thinking. These are the levels we'd like to see our students on: DOK 2, 3, and 4. In DOK 3, in science, we're requiring evidence and reasoning and higher order thinking. We have multi-step tasks that require students to justify and their responses and explain their thinking. We want them to be able to cite evidence, like in our CER model, develop logical arguments, and draw conclusions from data. And the key concepts for that are developing models, forming conclusions, designing investigations. When we get up to the top level, which is DOK 4, and again, if you go back and look at that 5E model, that falls into that final category. We want to look at extending thinking, and open-ended tasks requiring significant and complex thought. We're looking at extended periods of time for scientific investigation, like when students are doing science fair projects. We're also making the connections and relating ideas to different things that they've already learned. Our key concepts in here are conducting experiments, deducting relationships, and analyzing data. When we look at third grade Amplify assessments, this is an example of an Amplify lesson 1. If you notice, within this lesson, which is lesson 4.2 for third grade, students focus on evaluating evidence. If you look at the left side, you'll see a key that shows you where the different levels of DOK can be found within this particular lesson. In this lesson, they review the evidence or criterion used in chapter 1, which would be DOK level 1. The students also gain experience by working with an example that uses new criterion, and they sort evidence from the islands using both criteria. This would fall into DOK 2, as well as students trying to find a pattern in local weather. And this also goes up to DOK 3, where students would be able to reflect on what evidence is needed to make a convincing argument for the island that will continue to have the best weather for orangutans. They also practice evaluating evidence with different criterion and provide information for the teacher on how well students are applying these criteria. Now, if you notice, certain words are in those particular DOK levels. So when we're looking at DOK 3, what you notice is you see that they're citing evidence, they're making arguments. These things are all on that top tier layer of not just recalling things, but being able to take what they recall, use examples and relate it to other things, and on top of that, take that and use it as reflections and make convincing arguments from what evidence they've collected. We also have here an example of a third grade Amplify example 2, where we see DOK 4. This is also in the third grade 4.3 lesson from Amplify, where students focus on designing solutions to prevent damage caused by natural hazards. So if you notice, highlighted in yellow, you have working in pairs. Students use simple materials to build fortified structures that are meant to withstand a hurricane. After testing each pair's structure, the class discusses what made some designs more effective than others. So I'm going to quickly go backwards before we move forward and show you guys where those things fit in. So where you saw the DOK level 1, that was recalling information in that particular example. But what I really want you to look at is the DOK 3 strategic thinking. So if you look at the fourth space down, you see citing evidence, developing logical arguments, drawing conclusion from data. This helps for something to be labeled as DOK3, where they're strategically thinking about what they've seen and what they've discussed. Then that DOK level 4 takes you into extended periods of time for scientific investigations. If we go back here to that example, we see that the students are using simple materials to build a structure. They're working in pairs. They are meant to withstand a hurricane. So within this actual lesson, they've learned about hurricanes. They've learned the basics of everything, but now we're taking everything we know, we've learned. We've also taken the evidence and things that we cited, and we're using that to be able to build something that is applicable to the situation. In this second section, we're going to talk about what DOK looks like in the classroom in science. In this actual presentation, you're able to click on what we call detailed descriptions of DOK levels for science. Within that, and I'm going to go back to it, you can actually see a PDF document that spells out everything we discussed about the DOK levels and what they look like in a science class. This is accessible to you if you do download or use the bit.ly to get to this presentation, and you'll be able to read through each one and see. But what I really would like to just kind of go back to is that level 3 and level 4. Level 3, strategic thinking, requires deep knowledge using reasoning, planning, using evidence, and higher level thinking than the previous 2 levels. It says that the cognitive demands at level 3 are complex and abstract. So again, we see those words using evidence, we see higher levels of thinking, we see planning, and we see using reasoning. Again, if we go back to what we've discussed previously, especially during TDW, using those CER charts are very important when you're trying to get students to understand that strategic thinking and that level 3 depth of knowledge. Level 4, again, is extended thinking, and that requires a high cognitive demand. It's very complex because, again, students are required to make connections. They're supposed to relate ideas within the content area and among content areas, and have to select or devise an approach among many alternatives where a situation or something can be solved. So again, looking back at that past example, they were building something. They were building something based on what they've learned within the classroom. So when we're talking about science, recall and reproduction, we're looking at recalling simple facts, terms, or properties. We're demonstrating rote responses. Anything most of the time that you will be doing at the beginning of a lesson will be considered DOK1, recall and reproduction. They're providing or recognizing a standard scientific representation for something simple within a phenomenon. And we're also looking at things to be clearly defined as steps. So when we're going through steps or calculating just a number or identifying something, this is still DOK level 1 because it's rote memorization of a process. When we're talking about DOK level 2, you're looking at skills and concepts. Again, as I described earlier, we're looking at describing and explaining examples and non-examples of certain concepts. We're formulating a routine problem given data and conditions. So children are not creating here. They're being given certain things and being asked to relate that to something else that they have done previously. When we're making observations, when we're comparing data, when we're classifying or organizing things, or even coming up with estimates, these things are still considered DOK level 2 because they are skills and concepts. when we interpret information from just a simple graph, and we're not doing anything more than just interpreting information from that graph, depending on what we knew previously, then that would be still considered DOK level 2. When we get into that deep level of level 3 of strategic thinking, which is where we want to be, we're looking at interpreting information from a complex graph, using reasoning, planning, and evidence. Again, those words again, reasoning, evidence. Explaining your thinking, justifying a response, not just giving me a response, but why is it that response? Identifying research questions and designing investigations. We're looking at forming conclusions from experimental or observational data. So I may have collected the data and given you the data, which would be in that level 2, but now being able to explain, give you conclusions based on that data is taking me into DOK level 3. Citing evidence, conducting and designed investigation, a designed investigation. So that means in this particular one, that the investigation was already designed by the teacher. So if a teacher gives a student something, an experiment or some type of activity where they have designed it themselves and said, okay, you're going to do this, this, and this, and then we'll see what you have, and then you have to explain it, that is still considered DOK level 3 because we're conducting an experiment that has already been designed. You don't get into the DOK level 4 until the students are designing their own experiments or investigations to be able to figure out a problem. Now, that extended thinking, we're looking at devising an approach among different alternatives to solve a problem. So again, unlike DOK level 3, where we're giving the students a prescribed way to find something and they're having to explain what their findings are, in this particular, in DOK level 4, they actually are coming up with their own way to solve a problem. It's based on provided data from a complex experiment that may be novel to the student. We're conducting investigations from specifying a problem to designing and carrying out an experiment and analyzing this data and forming conclusions. These are things that we find especially when students are preparing for science fair, and this year for our fall elementary science fair, as well as for our spring STEM challenge, our students will walk through all levels of DOK to be able to get to a product. We're looking at relating ideas with content area and among content areas, and we're developing generalizations of results obtained from strategies used and apply them to new problems and situations. If you notice, and again, I will go backwards here, on each one of our DOK levels, there's a note on the side. So for DOK level 1, if the knowledge necessary to answer an item is automatically provides the answer, it is level 1. So that's just a kind of a key for people to remember. So if it's automatically provide the answer, it's usually level 1. For level 2, if the knowledge necessary to answer an item does not automatically provide the answer, then the item is at least a level 2. Most actions imply more than one step. At level 3, this is complex and abstract. If more than one response is possible, it is at least a level 3 and calls for us to use reasoning, justification, evidence as support for these responses. And level 4 are activities. These often require an extended period of time for carrying out multiple steps. However, time alone is not a distinguishing factor if the skills and concepts are simply repetitive over time. So if a student is doing an activity and they're just doing that same activity over and over, and they did not come up with that activity on their own, and we're not having that actual rich thinking into how this is working with other parts, it would not be a DOK level 4 just because it's an activity. So we have to remember that those activities must be selected or devised from with many alternatives. They must be conducted investigations that the students have come up with on their own. Finally, in this section, we'll talk about how do we effectively integrate DOK in our assessments. Now, in this particular section, we are going to do an activity. First of all, our science benchmarks. Just to give everybody a heads up, or well, not necessarily a heads up, a gentle reminder, for this 22-23 school year and beyond, the science team and the lead teachers from across the district will be putting out LEAP-like district unit assessments for grades K through 12 for all science courses. They are required to be taken. For K through 2, they have the option of giving them online in the Illuminate platform or printing them and having the students to do them on paper and pencil. For grades 3 through 5, they are all located on Illuminate and will be updated within your year in a detailed document as we place them in there. For 6 through 8, this is another reminder. 6 through 8 has 8 units in all of our middle school classes. So for those 8 units, we have paired them. So each one of your particular assessments will be on 2 units at a time. Units 1 and 2, then units 3 and 4, units 5 and 6, and then units 7 and 8. The assessments will all be housed in Illuminate for all teachers to use, and they'll also be linked on the science page so that you can get to them. You will be given to everyone in grades K through 8, physical science, biology, chemistry, physics, environmental science, and anatomy and physiology. So please be on the lookout for those, as some of them will be coming up as sooner than you know it. So when we're talking about LEAP, on the LEAP test, the students must be able to do 3 things: apply content, knowledge, and skills, investigate, evaluate, and reason scientifically, and connect ideas across discipline. So when we're talking about applying content, knowledge, and skills, students answer questions which require content, knowledge, and skill aligned to the performance expectations and the corresponding disciplinary core ideas. When we're talking about investigating, evaluating, and scientifically reasoning, students do more than just answer and recall. They apply the practices or behaviors of scientists and engineers as students investigate real-world phenomenon and design solutions to problems, which is what they should be doing in the classroom. And when we talk about connecting ideas across discipline, sets of questions assess student application of knowledge across the domains of science for a comprehensive picture of student readiness for their next grade or course in science. On our LEAP 2025, we have different types of test items. We have select response, which include traditional multiple choice, but they also have multiple select questions with 5 answer options, and more than one answer will be correct. The question normally will say, of these answers, which 3 or 4 or 5, it does identify, are the correct answers. In our 2-part selected response questions, we have different types. We have a 2-part dependent and 2-part independent. In a 2-part dependent question, that means that the student must get both parts of the question right in order to receive any points. That means that both of those both parts of the question depend on each other. In a 2-part independent, they can get one right and still get points for that one, even if they got the second one wrong. And when we talk about constructive response, these are items that may require a brief paragraph or a few sentences, or possibly the completion of some type of chart or graph. So let's go into our activity. This is our sample items. Up here, there's sample items for assessment guidance. And you can actually go in and they will show you for the different assessments that will be given. And you'll be able to look at those ahead of time for your backwards design. In this activity, we're going to determine the correct DOK levels and explain why for the provided sample assessment. We're going to discuss within this group and we will share out accordingly. So with that being said, I'm going to put up the first example. I'm going to let the ladies who are on this call have a look at it, and then I will stop sharing the screen so they can discuss it as a group. Question 1, and these are elementary based. It says use the information and your knowledge of science to answer the following question. A scientist has been studying the amount of fresh water stored in a polar ice cap for many years. He believes that one of the ice sheets in Antarctica is getting smaller. What kind of data should the scientist collect to determine whether the ice sheet is changing size? Measure the depth of the ice sheet for several months. Measure the mass of the ice sheet for several weeks. Measure the area and thickness of the ice sheet for several years, or measure the width of the ice sheet from satellite images for several days. Is everyone taking a look at the question? And you can unmute your mics, ladies. So I'm going to stop sharing so that we can discuss.
Okay, first off, I do believe that the children have to conduct, well, I don't know, they're conducting an investigation, but they also have to interpret data that they collect as well. So that would, in my opinion, be a DOK 3.
Okay. So anybody else? And I can put the question back up.
Yes, please. Can you put the question back up?
What kind of data should the scientists collect to determine whether the ice sheet is changing size?
It looks like a level 3 because it says that level 3 is identify research questions and design investigations for a scientific problem. So that's definitely a research question and an investigation for a design for an experiment. So I agree with Karen that it's going to be a level 3.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask a question about that. It gives you information on the front, but then it says, what kind of data? The question, the actual real question, is what kind of data should the scientists collect to determine whether the ice sheet is changing size? So if I'm just asking you what type of data you should collect, is that a level 3? The first part is a trick because it's just talking about basically the scientists. But the question itself is what kind of data should the scientists collect? Do they measure depth? Do they measure mass? Do they measure area and thickness? Or do they measure width? Is that a level 3?
So you're saying it'd more likely be level 2 because that's formulate a routine problem given data and conditions. So it actually gives the data and it gives the conditions. So all they have to do is decide exactly what method to use. So it's more like a level 2.
Right. And DOK 3 requires the students to have deep knowledge, and it's more complex and abstract. So I don't think this is very abstract or requires abstract thinking.
Okay.
So DOK 2 would be my vote in this case.
Yeah, I personally would give it between a 1 and a 2, depending on the knowledge that the students had previously.
Okay.
Depending on what they had been talking about, it could be between a 1 and a 2. So for the next question, we have question 2. And I'm going to go ahead and just leave the questions up instead of taking them down so that you can really analyze them and look at them while we're on. So it says, use the information and your knowledge of science to answer the question. A student created a circle graph to show the approximate area of Earth covered by fresh water, lands, and ocean. The distribution of land and water is shown below. So we see 69% ocean, 2% fresh water, and 29% land. Based on the graph, which estimate best describes the Earth's surface covered with salt water and fresh water?
This will probably be DOK 1 because it's just requiring them to, or between 1 and 2, it's requiring them to, it is skill-based. They don't have to recall the information per se, but the information is provided in the question. Or the answer is provided in the question, or the information that's provided along with the question. So I would say between the 1 and 2.
Yeah, it's a really simple circle graph. It's not a complex graph. So like you said, based on prior knowledge, between a 1 and a 2.
And I agree. That would be between a 1 and a 2. For our next one, we have question 3. It says a scientist took samples of different sources of water from an area. She recorded her data. Salt water has salt concentration of at least 1,000 parts per million. Which 2 samples are most likely freshwater samples? Use the data from the table to explain your answer. And there were some words in there that should lead you towards your DOK level.
Well, they're having to explain their thinking in this question.
But what else are they doing besides just explain? What are they doing to explain?
Using their data.
Data. So they're drawing conclusions from data.
That's more of a complex chart. They're not just reading it. They have to interpret, be able to read it and interpret the data. So that's probably pushing closer to a level 3 DOK.
Yeah, DOK 3, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes, this is definitely a DOK 3. And this is because they are using data. So yes, they're provided with the chart and they're provided with information just like they were provided with the circle graph. But here, they actually have to use data and explain it. That's where we're talking about that claims and evidence. Yes. So claims, evidence, and reasoning. So they're explaining their answers through the reasoning.
Right.
Thank you, ladies. And one last question. We have question 4. It says a group of students created a circle graph that shows the distribution of water on Earth. Which statement best describes the distribution of water on Earth? Most of Earth's water is stored in oceans. Most of Earth's water is frozen in polar ice caps. Most of Earth's water is flowing in streams and rivers. Most of Earth's water is trapped in underground aquifers.
I was just looking at
That's drawing conclusions as well. DOK 3.
3.
That's
well, they have to be able to not just read the graph. They have to be able to interpret knowledge from the reading on the graph, but they're not being asked to explain their reasoning. So it's probably more closer to a 2 because they're not having to explain. If they had to explain their answer, like write it out, then it would be a 3.
Okay.
I would give it between a 2 and a 3, and the reason is if you look at the actual pie graph, it does not say oceans, it does not say polar ice caps, it does not say streams and rivers, and it does not say underground aquifers. So a student would have to know previously that the Earth's water in oceans are salt water.
Right.
They would have to know that frozen fresh water is found in a polar ice cap. They would have to know that underground fresh water is found in underground aquifers. They would have to know what those things are to be able to answer the question. So you couldn't just answer the question straight out, because if I didn't know that salt water was in the oceans, if I thought salt water was in a polar ice cap, then my answer would be B.
Right.
All righty. So with that being said, we had one more question, but I'm going to skip that question because it's very small. But I will leave it in the presentation for those who would like to look at it later. But this question here is DOK level 4 or 5.
4.
So they're using
You have to
multiple
provide
sources,
evidence,
and they have
sources,
to explain
right.
their answer using evidence for it. I would lean more towards a 4 because they're not creating anything.
Extended
But it said,
thinking.
imagine if the plants were removed from the food chain. So they actually are kind of creating their own food chain without plants and then explaining it.
Right.
They're not physically making.
I'd like to thank everybody who watched this video today. I'd also like to thank the content trainers who were on today, Ms. Heather Cifrio, Ms. Karen Johnson, and Ms. Zaviola Bengel, who were able to assist us with that activity and answer questions. My name is Dr. Kristen Antoine Morse, and I can be reached at KANTOINE2@ebrschools.org. If you have any questions. Thank you so much from the Department of Academics for sitting in and listening on this video, and we'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day.